I was wrong, the billionaire said, his voice low enough to silence a room that had never learned how to listen, and every eye turned not to him, but to the waitress he had mocked just minutes before, because moments earlier the night had looked very different, filled with laughter that rang a little too loud beneath the golden lights of a Manhattan dining room, where crystal glasses caught reflections of power and money and men who believed they owned both. And at the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, leaning back in his chair like the room belonged to him, his tailored suit untouched by the long day, his watch catching just enough light to remind everyone at the table exactly who he was. And when Clara Whitmore approached, quiet and composed in her black and white uniform, she moved like she had nothing to prove, her steps steady, her gaze calm, her presence almost invisible in a space designed to ignore people like her. Evening, she said softly, setting down water glasses with precise movements, her voice neither timid nor bold, just balanced, like someone who had learned the value of restraint. But Ethan barely glanced at her, his attention fixed on the story he was telling, something about a deal, a big one, numbers tossed around like they meant nothing, millions discussed with the casual tone of ordering another drink, and his friends nodded, impressed or pretending to be, until his eyes flicked up at Clara again, pausing just long enough to notice her stillness. And something in him, boredom, maybe, or habit, decided to turn her into entertainment. You ever hear numbers like this before? He asked, a smirk forming as the table quieted just slightly, not out of respect, but curiosity. Clara met his gaze briefly, not challenging, not submissive, just present. I hear a lot of things, she replied, her tone even, and a couple of his friends chuckled, sensing where this was going. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as if inviting a performance. All right then, he said, tapping a printed contract beside his glass. Tell me what this clause means, his fingers sliding across the page with deliberate exaggeration, the kind meant to draw attention, to create a moment, to remind everyone who held the power. If you can, he added, and the laughter came quicker this time, louder, sharper, cutting through the soft jazz playing in the background. But Clara didn't react the way they expected. She didn't blush or stumble or laugh it off. She simply glanced down at the document for a brief second, just enough, and then looked back at him, her expression unchanged. It means the risk isn't where you think it is, she said quietly, and for a split second, no one moved. The laughter didn't stop all at once. It faded, like a sound realizing it had arrived too early. Ethan tilted his head, amused more than anything. Oh really? He said, leaning back again. And where is it exactly? And Clara held his gaze for just a fraction longer this time. Not long enough to challenge him, but long enough to shift something in the air. Page 14, she said, her voice still calm. The wording changes the liability. And then, just as smoothly as she had arrived, she stepped back, turning slightly as if to continue her work, leaving behind a table that hadn't quite decided whether to laugh again or not. And Ethan exhaled a short breath through his nose, shaking his head with a smile that said he wasn't taking her seriously, not yet. But his fingers moved anyway, flipping the page almost out of instinct. And somewhere between the turning of that paper and the silence that followed, the balance of the room began to shift. Though no one said it out loud, not yet. The page turned with a soft flick of paper, almost too quiet to matter. But the movement drew every eye at the table as Ethan Caldwell's fingers paused mid-motion, his expression shifting just slightly, not enough for anyone to call it concern, but enough to break the rhythm of his confidence. He scanned the clause again, slower this time, his eyes narrowing as the numbers and language he had glanced over earlier began to settle into something less certain, and across the table one of his friends leaned in, curious. What is it? He asked, but Ethan did not answer right away. Because for the first time that evening, he was not performing, he was reading, actually reading, and the room responded to that silence in the only way it could, by growing still, the kind of stillness that does not announce itself but quietly replaces the noise. And someone else chuckled nervously, trying to bring back the earlier energy. Come on, it is probably nothing, he said, but his voice did not carry the same ease as before. Ethan exhaled slowly, tapping the page once. Then again, as if confirming what he was seeing. This wording, he said finally, more to himself than to anyone else. It shifts the liability threshold. And the words landed differently now, no longer part of a story, but part of a realization. One of the men across from him straightened in his chair, reaching for the document. "Let me see that," he said, his tone sharper, more focused, and Ethan handed it over without argument, which in itself was unusual, and as the paper changed hands, the attention at the table followed it, like gravity had shifted from the man to the page. And somewhere behind them, Clara moved quietly between tables, refilling a glass, clearing a plate, her presence unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. But Ethan noticed, not directly, not obviously, just enough to be aware that she had not stayed to watch. She had simply spoken and left, and that absence began to feel heavier than any reaction would have been. "She said page 14. One of the men murmured, flipping back and forth, comparing sections, and another leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "If this triggers, you are exposed on both ends," he said, and Ethan's jaw tightened, just slightly, because now it was not just a possibility, it was a pattern, the kind that experienced eyes did not ignore. "That is not how it was explained," someone added. But Ethan did not respond to that either. Instead, he reached for his phone, his movements controlled, deliberate, and dialed a number he did not usually call during dinner. The line rang once, twice, and then connected. "I need you to look at section 14 of the draft we reviewed this afternoon," he said, his voice steady but lower now, stripped of the earlier edge. "Yes, right now." And as he listened, his gaze drifted, briefly, almost involuntarily, toward the far end of the room where Clara stood near the service station, writing something down with calm precision, her posture unchanged, her world untouched by the tension she had just created. And then the voice on the other end of the call shifted, just enough, a pause, followed by a quiet, "Wait," and Ethan's eyes stilled completely. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone sharpening again, but not with arrogance, with focus, and the answer came back in measured words that did not need to be repeated for the table to understand what was happening, because they could see it in his face, the slight tightening around his eyes, the stillness in his hand, the absence of any attempt to joke or deflect. And when he ended the call, he did not speak immediately. He simply placed the phone down beside the contract and looked at the page one more time, as if confirming that nothing had changed except his understanding of it. And in that quiet moment, the laughter from earlier felt distant, almost out of place, like it belonged to a different version of the night. "She was right," he said finally, the words simple, but heavier than anything he had said before, and no one at the table laughed this time. The words settled over the table with a weight no one could ignore, and for a moment no one moved, not because they did not know what to say, but because anything they said now would have to acknowledge something they had all just witnessed, and that was not easy, especially in a room built on certainty. One of the men leaned back slowly, letting out a low breath as he glanced at Ethan. "How much exposure are we talking about?" he asked, his voice careful, no longer casual, and Ethan did not answer immediately. He reached for the contract again, but this time he did not flip through it quickly. He studied it, line by line, as if the paper had changed shape in his hands. "7 figures at least," he said finally, his tone measured, stripped of any performance, and the number landed like a quiet shock, not dramatic, not loud, just undeniable. Another man shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "And no one caught this?" he muttered. But Ethan's gaze lifted slightly, not toward his friends, but toward the space where Clara had been standing earlier, and now was not. And that absence pulled at his attention more than the mistake itself, because the mistake was technical, it could be explained, but the way it had been revealed, that was something else entirely. He remembered the way she had spoken, not hesitant, not eager to prove anything, just precise, like someone who understood the weight of words and chose them carefully. "She caught it," Ethan said quietly, almost to himself, and the table followed his gaze now, subtle at first, then more openly, as if they were all trying to locate the same point in the room, the same quiet presence that had shifted everything. Across the dining area, Clara moved between tables with the same steady rhythm, refilling a glass here, placing a check there, her expression unchanged, her posture relaxed, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened, and that was what unsettled Ethan the most, not the correction, not the implication, but the fact that she had not stayed to watch the impact. She had not waited for recognition. She had simply done what needed to be done and stepped away. "Do you know her?" one of the men asked, his tone lower now, curiosity replacing amusement. Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he said. But even as he spoke, the answer felt incomplete, because knowing someone, he realized, was not always about introductions. Sometimes it was about understanding what they chose to reveal and what they did not. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed in her direction, his mind replaying the moment again. The timing, the confidence, the restraint, and something in him shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to recognize that he had misjudged something important, not the deal, but the person. "Get me the full background on this contract," he said, turning slightly to one of his associates, his voice returning to its usual clarity, but not its earlier tone. There was something different now, something more deliberate. "Tonight," he added, and the man nodded quickly, already reaching for his phone, but Ethan did not look back at the document. Instead, he stood, slowly, the movement drawing quiet attention from the surrounding tables, not because it was unusual, but because of the timing, because of the silence that followed it. And as he adjusted his jacket, his gaze shifted once more toward Clara, who now stood near the service station, speaking softly to another staff member, her hands moving with small, precise gestures, and for a brief second, their eyes met, not by accident, not entirely, and she did not look away immediately. She simply held the moment, calm, steady, as if acknowledging his presence without giving it power, and then she turned, returning to her work, leaving him standing there with a realization that felt unfamiliar, not loss, not embarrassment, but something quieter, something closer to clarity. And without another word to his table, Ethan Caldwell stepped away from his seat and walked in her direction, not as a man in control of the room, but as someone who had just realized he was not. The distance between them was not far, only a few steps across polished marble and quiet conversations, but it felt longer, stretched by something unspoken, something that had shifted without permission. And as Ethan Caldwell approached the service station, the noise of the dining room seemed to fade just slightly, not because it actually did, but because his attention narrowed, focused entirely on the woman who had not tried to prove anything, and yet had changed everything. Clara stood with her back partially turned, reviewing a small notepad, her pen moving with calm precision. And when she sensed him near, she did not startle, she did not rush. She simply finished the line she was writing, closed the pad, and looked up, her expression the same as before, composed, unreadable, present. "Is everything all right with your table?" she asked, her voice steady, professional, as if the last few minutes had not happened at all. And for a brief second Ethan did not answer, not because he did not know what to say, but because he was choosing his words more carefully than he had earlier, something he was not used to doing. "No," he said finally, his tone quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. "It is not." And the honesty in the statement hung between them, simple and direct. Clara held his gaze, not surprised, not impressed, just listening. "The clause you mentioned," he continued, glancing down briefly before meeting her eyes again. "You were right." And she gave a small nod, not triumphant, not dismissive, just an acknowledgement, like confirming a detail that had already been settled. "It happens," she said, her voice soft but clear, and the words were not condescending, not reassuring, just factual, and that made them land differently. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of the counter as if grounding himself in the moment. "I should not have spoken to you like that," he said, the sentence measured, deliberate. And this time there was no audience, no laughter waiting, just the quiet space between two people. Clara did not respond immediately. She studied him for a brief second, not in judgment, but in assessment, the kind that did not rely on words. "No," she said simply, and there was no softness in it, no attempt to ease the truth, just clarity. And Ethan gave a slight nod, accepting it without defense, without explanation, because for once, there was nothing to justify. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was not easy either. It required presence, something both of them held in different ways. A server passed behind Clara, placing a tray down, the faint clink of glass breaking the Stillness for a moment before fading again, and Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not retreating, not advancing, just standing there in a way that felt unfamiliar to him, unguarded. "You read that contract in seconds," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, more curious than impressed. "That is not something people pick up on the first look." Clara glanced down briefly, then back at him. "Some people do," she replied, and there was no need to elaborate. The answer was complete as it was. Ethan studied her, not as a server now, but as someone whose presence did not match her role, and the realization settled in quietly, without drama, without resistance. "You are not just a waitress," he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and Clara's expression did not change, not in surprise, not in denial, just a slight pause before she spoke again. "Tonight, I am," she said, and there was something in the way she said it, something grounded, something intentional, that made the distinction clear without needing further explanation. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell did not have a response ready. He simply stood there, absorbing the weight of a truth he had not considered before, that roles were temporary, but perception, that was where mistakes were made. And as Clara picked up her notepad again, turning slightly back toward her work, the conversation ended not with a conclusion, but with something quieter, something that lingered, because she had not raised her voice, she had not challenged him, she had simply revealed something he could not ignore. Clara did not wait for him to say anything more. She turned back to her duties with the same quiet efficiency, as if the conversation had simply been another task completed, and Ethan remained there for a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but because leaving too quickly would feel like returning to something he had already outgrown. And when he finally stepped back, the dining room seemed different, not in appearance, not in sound, but in meaning. The laughter from his table now felt distant, almost hollow, like an echo from a version of himself he no longer fully recognized. He walked back slowly, each step measured, his posture unchanged yet carrying something new, something less certain and more aware. And when he reached the table, the conversation stopped again, not abruptly, but naturally, because they had been watching, waiting, trying to understand what had just happened without asking directly. "Well?" one of them said, attempting a light tone that did not quite land. Ethan pulled out his chair but did not sit immediately, his hand resting briefly on the back of it as he looked at the contract still lying open. The same page, the same clause, but no longer the same certainty. "We are revising the deal," he said simply, and this time there was no room for debate in his voice, not because it was forceful, but because it was clear, and clarity did not need volume. One of the men frowned, leaning forward. "Because of what she said?" he asked, and the word she carried a different weight now, no longer dismissive, but curious, almost cautious. Ethan met his gaze, steady, unshaken. "Because it is wrong," he replied, and the distinction mattered, not just for the deal, but for everything that had led to this moment. Another man let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. "I ran the numbers again," he admitted. She caught something none of us did, and the table fell quiet again, not with discomfort, but with recognition, and for a group of men used to being right, that recognition was unfamiliar. Ethan finally took his seat, but he did not lean back this time. He remained forward, present, his hands resting lightly on the table, no longer performing, just thinking. And across the room Clara continued her shift, unaffected by the shift she had created, her movement steady, her focus intact, as if the outcome had never been hers to claim, and that, more than anything, stayed with him, because he had spent years building a world where recognition was currency, where being seen mattered, where impact was measured by attention, and yet she had done the opposite. She had changed the course of something significant, and then stepped away without waiting to be acknowledged. "You going to thank her?" someone asked, half serious, half testing, and Ethan's eyes lifted again, instinctively finding her among the movement of the room. And for a moment he did not answer, not because he had not thought about it, but because he was considering what that meant now. Not a gesture, not a performance, but something real. "I already did," he said quietly, though even as he spoke, he knew it was not complete, because gratitude was not always in words. Sometimes it was in what came after, in what changed, and he looked back down at the contract, closing it slowly, deliberately, as if marking the end of something more than just a deal. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different kind of authority, one that did not need to prove itself. "We start over," he said, and this time no one questioned him, not because they were convinced, but because they had seen enough to trust that something had shifted. And as the conversation resumed, quieter now, more grounded, Ethan's attention did not drift back to the numbers or the strategy. It stayed, in part, with the image of a woman who had said only what was necessary and nothing more, and in doing so had revealed a truth he could not ignore. That power was not always loud, and intelligence did not need permission to be seen. The rest of the evening unfolded without spectacle, but something had undeniably shifted, not just at Ethan's table, but in the way the room seemed to hold him, as if the quiet correction had left a trace that no one could fully ignore. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked again, but the tone had softened, the sharp edge of earlier laughter replaced by something more measured, and Ethan found himself speaking less, listening more. His usual rhythm disrupted in a way that did not feel like a loss, but like an adjustment, a recalibration he had not realized he needed. Across the room, Clara continued moving between tables with the same steady pace, her focus unwavering, her presence unchanged, and yet now she was no longer invisible, not to him, and not entirely to others either. A few glances lingered a second longer when she passed, not out of curiosity alone, but recognition, subtle, unspoken, and she did not acknowledge it. She did not slow down or alter her posture. She simply continued, as if the shift in perception belonged to them, not to her. And that distinction stayed with Ethan, because he had spent years mastering perception, shaping it, controlling it, and now he was watching someone who did not participate in that at all, who existed outside of it, and still commanded it without effort. The check arrived at his table, placed neatly at the edge, and for a moment he looked at it without reaching, not because he was distracted, but because it felt like a closing, not just of a meal, but of something larger. He picked it up slowly, scanning the numbers without really seeing them, his mind elsewhere, and then he reached into his jacket, pulling out his card with a motion that had once been automatic, now slightly more deliberate. As if even small actions carried more weight than before, he placed it down, but did not slide it forward right away. Instead, his gaze lifted again, finding Clara as she spoke quietly with an older couple near the window, her expression softening just slightly, her tone warmer. And it was in that moment he noticed something he had missed earlier, not intelligence, not composure, but care, the kind that did not need recognition to exist, and it settled in quietly, reshaping something he had long taken for granted. When she approached again, this time to collect the check, she did so with the same calm presence, her hand steady as she reached for the folder. But Ethan stopped her gently, not with urgency, not with authority, just enough to pause the moment. "Clara," he said, her name spoken clearly this time, not as a label, but as acknowledgement, and she looked at him, attentive but not expectant. "Thank you," he continued, his voice even, but carrying something deeper now, something that did not need elaboration, and she held his gaze for a brief second, then nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, but it was enough, because it was real, not performed, not exaggerated, just accepted. "You are welcome," she replied, and there was no trace of the earlier dynamic in her tone, no echo of the imbalance that had defined their first interaction, just a simple exchange between two people who now understood something they had not before. She took the check and stepped away, leaving Ethan with a stillness that did not feel empty, but complete. And as he stood to leave, adjusting his jacket once more, the room did not change, the lights remained the same. The conversations continued, but he walked through it differently, not as someone who owned the space, but as someone who had finally seen beyond it. And behind him, Clara continued her shift, unnoticed by many, but no longer unseen by the one person who had needed to understand the most. The night air outside felt different, cooler, quieter, as Ethan stepped onto the sidewalk, the city still alive around him, but no longer demanding his attention in the same way. Headlights passed, conversations drifted, a distant siren echoed somewhere far enough to feel unreal, and for the first time in a long while, he did not reach for his phone immediately. He did not check notifications or return messages or step back into the constant current of decisions and control. Instead, he stood still for a moment, his hands in his pockets, his gaze unfocused as the reflection of the restaurant's warm light lingered in the glass behind him, and his mind replayed the evening not as a sequence of events, but as a series of moments, small, precise, each one carrying more weight than it should have. The laugh that came too easily, the words that had been said without thought, the silence that followed, and then her voice, calm, measured, certain, cutting through everything without force. And he realized something that unsettled him in a quiet way. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple. She had not changed the situation. She had revealed it, revealed him, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. His driver stepped out of the car parked along the curb, opening the rear door with practiced efficiency. "Good evening, sir," he said, but Ethan did not move right away. He gave a slight nod, acknowledging the gesture, but his attention remained somewhere else, still inside, still at that table, still at that moment where certainty had slipped just enough to let something real in. He glanced back once, not dramatically, not searching, just a brief look toward the entrance, the soft glow behind the glass. And though he could not see her from there, he knew she was still inside, moving through her shift, unaffected, steady, and that thought stayed with him as he finally stepped into the car, the door closing with a quiet thud that felt more final than usual. The interior was silent, the familiar scent of leather and clean lines surrounding him, but tonight it did not feel like control, it felt like space. And as the car pulled away, merging into the flow of traffic, Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes tracing the passing lights without really focusing on them. And after a few seconds, he reached for his phone, but instead of opening his usual apps, he paused, then scrolled to a different contact, one he had not called in months, his legal advisor, the person who had overseen dozens of deals, trusted, efficient, unquestioned. The call connected quickly. "Ethan," the voice greeted, confident, ready. "I assume dinner went well." There was a brief silence before Ethan responded, not long, just enough to shift the tone. "We missed something," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made the other end go quiet. "Section 14, he continued. "I want a full review of every clause, every assumption, every risk." And the response came back sharper now, more attentive. "Of course, we can handle that first thing in the morning." But Ethan shook his head slightly, though the other person could not see it. "No," he said, "tonight." And there was no force in the word, no pressure, just clarity, the kind that did not leave room for delay. Another pause followed, shorter this time. "Understood," the voice replied, and the call ended without further discussion. Ethan lowered the phone, resting it lightly against his leg, and as the city continued to move outside his window, something inside him had already shifted ahead of it, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough to change the way he saw what came next, because for the first time, the most important part of the evening was not the deal he had almost signed. It was the moment he had almost ignored, and the quiet voice that had refused to let him. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale light slipping through the glass walls of Ethan Caldwell's office as the city below resumed its rhythm, steady, relentless, and unchanged. But inside, something had already shifted before the day had even begun. The reports were waiting on his desk, printed, organized, precise, every page marked with annotations from his legal team who had worked through the night exactly as instructed. And as Ethan stepped inside, setting his jacket aside, he did not rush, he did not skim. He walked to the desk and stood there for a moment, looking down at the stack as if measuring not the information, but the weight of what it represented. Then he picked up the first page, his eyes moving line by line, slower than usual, more deliberate, the confidence he once carried into every document replaced by something quieter, something sharper, awareness. And as he read, the pattern became undeniable. The clause Clara had pointed out was not an isolated flaw. It was part of a chain, subtle, carefully structured, easy to overlook if you were not looking closely enough, and he had not been. Not because he lacked the ability, but because he had trusted the process, trusted the people, trusted himself, and that realization settled in without resistance, not as regret, but as clarity. a shift in how he would move forward. His phone buzzed softly against the desk, a message from his advisor confirming the same conclusion he was now seeing in front of him. The risk was real, the exposure significant, and the deal, as it stood, was no longer acceptable. Ethan placed the paper down, exhaling slowly, not out of frustration, but acknowledgement. And then he did something unexpected. He reached for a blank notepad instead of another report, his pen hovering for a brief second before he wrote a single name at the top of the page. Clara Whitmore, the letters clean, intentional, and he paused, looking at it, not as a note, but as a reminder. Because what she had done the night before was not just correct a mistake, she had interrupted a pattern, one he had followed for years without question, and that interruption mattered, more than the numbers, more than the deal. It changed how he would see the next one. A knock came at the door, soft but precise, and his assistant stepped in, tablet in hand, ready with the day's schedule. "Your 9 o'clock is here," she said, her tone efficient, familiar, but Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze still on the name he had written, and then he looked up, his expression composed, but different in a way that was hard to define. "Reschedule it," he said, and the assistant blinked slightly, not out of confusion, but surprise, because that was not something he did, not without reason. "Is everything all right?" she asked, carefully, and Ethan gave a small nod. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "It will be," and there was no further explanation, none needed. She nodded and stepped back, closing the door quietly behind her, and Ethan turned back to the desk, gathering the reports into a single stack before setting them aside, not dismissed, but no longer the center of his attention. Instead, he reached for his phone, scrolling through a different set of information now, not contracts, not numbers, but something simpler, the address of a restaurant, the name of a place he had walked into the night before without thinking, and now returned to in a different way, not as a customer, not as a man expecting service, but as someone seeking understanding. And as he picked up his jacket again, moving toward the door with the same composed stride he had always carried, the difference was not in how he walked, but in why. Because for the first time in a long time, the most important decision of his day had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the moment he refused to ignore. The restaurant looked different in daylight, not because it had changed, but because the absence of evening shadows revealed things more clearly, the polished surfaces less dramatic, the atmosphere quieter, more honest. And when Ethan Caldwell stepped inside, there was no audience this time, no table of expectations waiting for him, just the soft clink of dishes and the low murmur of midday conversations. And for a moment he stood near the entrance, not out of hesitation, but awareness, recognizing that he was not returning to the same place, not in the way that mattered. Clara moved between tables as she had the night before, her pace steady, her presence calm, and when she noticed him, there was no surprise in her expression, just recognition, as if she had expected nothing and therefore was not unsettled by anything. He walked toward her without urgency, his posture composed but lighter, no longer carrying the need to prove anything. "I did not come for lunch," he said when he reached her, his voice even, and she tilted her head slightly, listening. "I figured," she replied, setting down a glass with the same precision as always, and there was a faint trace of something in her tone, not amusement, not judgment, just understanding. Ethan glanced briefly at the room around them, then back at her. "The deal is off," he said, the words simple, but deliberate, and Clara gave a small nod, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging the outcome. "That is probably for the best," she said, and there was no weight of validation in her voice, no sense of ownership over the result, just a statement of fact, and that, again, made the moment feel different. Ethan took a breath, then continued. "I had my team review everything," he said. "You were not just right, you were early." And this time she paused for a fraction longer, not because she needed the recognition, but because she understood what it meant for him to say it. "Timing matters," she replied quietly, and the words carried more meaning than they appeared to. Ethan nodded once, absorbing it, then looked at her with a clarity that had not been there before. "So does perspective," he said, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence not empty, but complete. And then Ethan did something that did not match the version of himself from the night before. He reached into his jacket, not for a card, not for a gesture of transaction, but for a simple folded note. He placed it gently on the counter, not pushing it toward her, not insisting, just leaving it there. "If you ever decide that tonight is not the only role you want," he said, his voice calm, "I would like to hear your thoughts in a different setting." And Clara looked at the paper, then back at him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes holding something more focused now, something that measured intention rather than words. "And if I do not?" she asked, not challenging, just clarifying, and Ethan gave a slight nod, accepting the question fully. "Then nothing changes," he said, "except what already has." And that was the difference, not an offer, not an expectation, but an acknowledgement. Clara studied him for a brief second longer, then reached for the note, not quickly, not reluctantly, just with the same steady movement she brought to everything else. "I will think about it," she said, and there was no promise in it, no obligation, just possibility. Ethan inclined his head slightly, not as a gesture of power, but respect, and then he stepped back, giving the space back to her, to the room, to the moment. And as he turned to leave, there was no need to look back this time, because the understanding did not require confirmation. It had already settled where it needed to, and behind him, Clara returned to her work, her pace unchanged, her presence steady, but something in the room lingered, not loud, not visible, just a quiet shift in how one person saw another. And in that space, something more lasting than any deal had already been made, because she had not raised her voice, she had not asked to be seen, she had simply been clear, and in that clarity, he had finally learned how to listen.